We're going to get started with the card scraper because that's where I started, and I'm sure you started with one of these too. It's a fairly simple tool to use, and even if you don't get a really good edge on it to begin with, you can still get a halfway decent surface out of it on a board. Once you learn how to burnish it properly and get the proper form for it, you're going to be pulling shavings like, you know, nobody's business then. It's almost as good as a hand plane. So what a card scraper is just a hunk of hardened tool steel, and we hone up one edge so that it's square to the two faces, just like if we were going to be doing this to a board. We join it square to the two faces and straight. Then we take a tool called a burnisher, which is just a harder piece of steel, and we actually just push the edge over until it creates a little hook on there. And then we use it to literally just scrape off the surface of a board. It'll help you get rid of machine marks, tear out, all that kind of stuff. So where we start with this is we're going to put it in the vise and get started showing you how we joint that edge. I've got the scraper mounted in the vise, and we're going to take a file and run it along here and joint this edge perfectly straight and square to the front and back face of this thing. One of the things you can do, I'm going to freehand this by the way, but if you're having trouble freehanding this, or if you haven't done this very much, one of the things you can do is just take a scrap block of wood and use that as a gauge to run along here. So what we're going to do is take that board, set my file on top of there, and I'm going to raise it up until you can hear I'm just touching on both sides, right? So if I was going to use that as a guide, now I'm parallel to the bench. This is perpendicular to the bench because my vise holds things perpendicular to the bench. So I've got my file on top of my board, and I can just joint right across there. And the whole idea is, this had a burr on it from before, so I'm trying to get down to the point where that burr just sort of flakes off of there. So another way, if you're not going to use the block as, you know, training wheels, what I do is I'll actually take and tuck my fingers right underneath and run my knuckles on the bench top as a guide. So once I get it to the point where I'm fairly perpendicular to the faces of the scraper, I just apply even pressure and run straight across there. And I'm pretty good there. I can actually start to flake that, what was left of that burr, up and off of there. If you're starting out with a brand new card scraper, you just bought one, you haven't sharpened it or done anything to it, it's really good to start by joining the edge, because you never know exactly what has transpired in the life of that card scraper before you've gotten it. There may be nicks, there may be things that have, you know, not been quite, you know, maybe it got bumped around, didn't quite get sanded straight and square from the factory, those kinds of things. So it's always good to start out by jointing your edges on the scraper. So the next step is we're going to pull this out of the vise and get started using some stones to hone the edges of this scraper. I've taken my 1200 grit king stone and I've clamped it in my vise, and I'm going to show you why in just a second. The first thing we're going to do is take that nicely filed edge, and we're going to start by honing the face. So I'm going to lay the scraper right down flat on the stone, back and forth. Need a rag. Try and keep my hands at least semi-clean through this process. Flip over. Hone the other side. And all we're trying to do is get rid of any of the last remnants of that burr. Got a little bit up on this corner, so we'll hit that a little more. Just like a chisel or a hand plane iron, as you hone this face, you're going to push that burr over onto the edge, and then when we start to hone the edge, which is what I'm going to do right now, we're going to start to push that burr back onto the face side. So we're trying to get to the point where we have no burr in either direction. So to help keep this edge perfectly square to the faces, you can see I've left that stone just up above the surface of my bench. I lay my card scraper down right on the bench and just move back and forth until I no longer feel any burr on the edge. It's now coming off that face, so I'm going to take my scraper and go back across the stone on both surfaces. No burr there, none there. The edge feels pretty good. So it's time to switch out from my 1200 grit stone, and I'm going to go to my 4000. I'm going to set that down in there so that we are just above the surface of the bench. I can then take my 4000 grit and hone it a little bit. Now I said I was going to go to 4000, but I'm not trying to get a mirror polish on everything. I'm just trying to make sure that my edge is good and smooth and that I don't have a whole lot of pits and ridges into that edge of that scraper, because when I put the burnisher to it and turn that edge, the sharper I can get it, I just think it turns, you know, out, giving you a nicer surface when you hone, when you scrape. That's looking pretty good. So I think it's time to do a little burnishing. Take the stone out of there. Throw the vise, throw the card scraper back in the vise. And I don't want it sticking out too terribly far. We want to be able to put some pressure on this thing without bending the scraper over. So now I'm using a triangular burnisher. You can use a round burnisher. If you don't have a burnisher, a good screwdriver would do, as long as it's good and hard. The idea is we're going to put a fair amount of downward pressure on this, and what we're trying to do is you want to use just that edge of the screwdriver or the corner of the triangular burnisher. The idea is you're trying to focus all of that energy, all that pressure right onto a single point and help push that edge of that card scraper over. So what I'm going to do is set my burnisher right on the edge of my scraper. I'm going to kick it over 10 or 15 degrees, put a fair amount of downward pressure on there, and just pull that thing across. You can push it back if you'd rather. The idea is we're just trying to mash that corner right over. Now, if you want to put a little oil on the edge of this so that it slides a little bit better, that's fine. I just find that I can't feel the edge turning over with the oil, and I usually just don't end up with as good an edge as I do if I do it dry. So I'm going to keep going a little bit more. And now I'm going to hit that front edge, so I'm going to tip my burnisher the opposite direction. Oh, excellent. That's going to be a good one. The last little tip I can give you is I tend to take my card scraper, once I've burnished it, I use the tip of my triangular burnisher because it comes to a point, and what I do is I set it into that little area right at the base of the hook, and I just slide it right along there. If you don't have a pointed triangular one, you can use the corner of a screwdriver, and what you're trying to do is get that tip in there just to be able to sort of open up that hook a little bit. So now that I've got that done, let's head to the other end of the bench and see exactly how this thing works. Well, I've got that piece of curly maple clamped in my vise that you saw in the opening of the show, and I've got the card scraper that we just sharpened up, and I'm going to show you the proper form for this. We want to take and get your fingers sort of wrapped around there. I normally take that first, my knuckle there, wrap it around the edge of the scraper, and I want my thumbs sort of pushing against the back. We're actually going to try and bend the scraper a little bit, and the idea is you want to, you can see that curve that I'm putting on there, and what that's going to do is that's going to allow that hooked edge to bite as we scrape across the board. So you can see I've got some tear out here in this end of the board. So what I want to do is find a spot. Oh, perfect, look at that. We're pulling just absolutely super thin shavings right off of there. And the great thing about a card scraper is, you saw I started on one side and I kept working my way across. So I don't have to stick in one spot and use that burnished edge forever. And you can see that tear out is starting to disappear as we do that. So the idea is, you can see also that I'm putting a fair amount of downward pressure on there. So you want to, you can see I'm at about, probably about a 25-30 degree angle to the board to get that edge to bite. The other thing, if you listen, when I go this way and I have the blade sort of skewed to the board this way, I'm lining up actually with my stripes in my board. I don't know if you're picking that up on camera or not, but it almost sounds like it's skipping across the board. And what's happening is we're digging in on the softer areas and bouncing off the harder areas. In figured wood like this, all those stripes are more end grain than they are side grain, which gives it that striping effect. So every time I hit one of the stripes, I bounce off it. To avoid some of that, I want to turn and go skew it the other way. And again, I'm not sure if you're picking that up or not, but all of a sudden it has a more uniform sound. It doesn't sound like it's skipping across the board. And it's leaving behind a pretty nice finish. Make sure you joint and hone your edges nice and square. Turn a decent sized burr onto that when you burnish it at your vise there. Make sure you're putting lots of downward pressure on there. Oil or no oil is up to you. Open up that burr a little bit and then get the proper form for getting a bend onto that scraper, and then give it a shot on some nice figured wood and see what it does. I'll bet it leaves a pretty good finish for you.